See, I was wrong. Tariffs were not the worst idea that Donald Trump had concerning the U.S. economy. Port fees and new levies to be placed on Chinese shipping containers, making ports of call at U.S. ports, are the worst idea that he's ever had. In the words of one economic expert on maritime policy and economics, it will be an apocalypse for trade. And it's being considered right now in hearings before the U.S. Trade Representative, in particular, to place levies or port of call fees on each ship that comes in to a U.S. port, which means from China. 80% of all ships in the world are built in China. 0.01% of the ships in the world are built in the U.S. 50% of overall tonnage, meaning cargo, comes through a Chinese vessel, right? 83% of all ships would be subject to this $1 to $3 million port arrival new levy by Donald Trump. 2/3 of all cars arriving on shipping would be subject to this $1 to $3 million fee, and 1/3 of all oil. What do you think that's going to do to the worldwide economy? I get the problem, and we're going to talk about it right here on Legal AF. I'm Michael Popok. The problem is that the Chinese have been eating our lunch for the last 15 years in maritime logistics, in ships that bring the world of goods to our shores. But penalizing the Chinese with a fee to try to raise $40 billion could have the impact of trillions of dollars of loss on the U.S. economy. If you live in or near a port city, a smaller port city, like in Delaware or in Philadelphia or in San Diego, you can say goodbye to port cargo because the Chinese will reroute it. And where is a willing and open arms for rerouting cargo to ports in North America? I can think of two. One's name is Canada and the other's name is Mexico. So if you're the Chinese, to pay back America and to avoid these $1 to $3 million every time the ship arrives at a port fee, you send your goods. You do one of two things. You shove everything through the major ports in America, and you effectively cut off and suffocate and strangle the smaller ports and smaller port cities and the voters there and the U.S. citizens there. And or, that's one, and or you go through Mexico and Canada. Now, Trump thinks with these phony hearings, and I'll concede, the start of the analysis was with the Biden administration because, you got to call it for what it is. The Chinese have focused on an area that we have ignored. We used to dominate 30, 40, 50 years ago. Not only the ports of the America were dominating, but shipbuilding, the logistics around getting cargo around. That is the world economy. As I've said before, we as Americans, our competitive advantage is we produce more than we need. We have a tremendous economic factory capacity engine, and we can produce more goods and services than any other economy in the world. But we have to have markets for those goods and services. Americans just can't eat more soybeans. They just can't consume more consulting service contracts. It has to go somewhere. But Donald Trump is busy shutting the door down on these market entries for U.S. goods and services. We do that exceedingly well, best in the business. But the Chinese decided they were going to focus about a dozen years ago on how goods move around the world, and they would dominate it, while U.S. shipbuilding operations were focused on military and building, the finest fleet for the U.S. Navy and Air Force and other things. It was blocking the ability. We were not focused on the ability or the capacity to build cargo and maritime shipping. I mean, the number delta, the size differential between Chinese shipbuilding capacity and U.S. is astronomical. We build 0.01% of the cargo ships. They build 80% of the cargo tonnage ships. What does that tell you? We've been asleep at the switch for a long, long time. And now Donald Trump is going to try to, including during his first administration, and Donald Trump's now with, as one maritime expert says, with a sledgehammer, is going to just ruin U.S. and global economies. We can't fix overnight with a bunch of phony hearings in Washington the problem of the Chinese dominating in supply chain logistics and the national security and economic security implications of that. So I feel bad if this ever gets passed to levy $1 to $3 million, not per year, per ship, per port of call, per arrival. I feel sorry for the U.S. economy. I feel sorry for those people that depend in those communities that have smaller ports that are going to be abandoned and strangulated in this fight between China and the U.S. The reality is we're not going to be able to reverse a dozen years of bad policy and being asleep at the switch and get some sort of dominance over the supply chain. That is where, the Chinese have been working, in broad daylight in building infrastructure around the world to curry favor in the Caribbean. All you got to do is go to the Caribbean, go to any island. And when you see a new bridge, a new tunnel, a new hydroelectric plant, a new road, it was Chinese built. It wasn't U.S. built. And we're quickly, with Trump, getting out of the business of diplomacy through infrastructure investment, through commercial investment. Donald Trump just killed U.S. aid and its $70 billion budget, which was not only humanitarian, but was also commercial and transactional and kept people looking towards the West and away from China and Russia instead of chasing them into the willing arms of the Chinese and the Russians. And so here's another example. Chinese build an infrastructure around the world to curry favor and to have a sphere of influence over these countries, so they can call on these chits when they need it at the UN and of course, all of these Caribbean countries ring the United States, right? So they have a sphere of influence just off our shores, the way Russia used to do that in Venezuela, in Cuba, and in other places. Chinese following the same playbook. While they were doing that, we were asleep at the switch. While the Chinese were focused on shipbuilding, maritime logistics, cargo, controlling ports. What were we doing? Not that. So we ceded to the Chinese over the last 20 years, and 15 in particular, dominance in an area on the high seas, but this time a commercial, not military, while we focused on the military. Now, Donald Trump, between his tariffs and tariff wars with China and his levies and fines on China, is just going to send the U.S. economy into a tailspin. We saw a market uptick today on tech stocks, only because their prices are so battered and so low that now they're deals, right? They beat all the value out. Trump beat all the value out of it, and now they're bargain hunting. So that's a momentary blip. That's just people rebalancing their portfolios, at the high institutional level. But these trade hearings about Chinese dominance and the way they think they're going to be able to tax and fee and fine their way out of it just shows you how there's just a lack of nuance and understanding. It's just blunt force trauma with Donald Trump in every aspect of domestic and foreign policy and economic policy and national security policy. He knows, what's the old line? To a hammer, everybody's a nail. Donald Trump is only a hammer. You look at his tool bag, it's just hammers. There's no wrench, there's no plier, there's no level, there's no miter, there's nothing of sophistication. It's just bigger and bigger hammers, and that he applies to friends and enemies, foes alike. I continue to follow it all right here. Sometimes I put on my Wall Street hat on Legal AF. Thanks for being part of our community. I'm Michael Popok. In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.